What happens when evil wears a beautiful face? When monsters look like the couple you'd invite to your barbecue? When the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the most innocent? Today, we're diving deep into one of Canada's most notorious criminal cases, not just for the horrific crimes committed, but for how one perpetrator managed to manipulate an entire justice system, fool trained investigators, and ultimately walk free while her victims' families continued to suffer. This is the story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, known as the Ken and Barbie Killers. But more than that, this is a story about deception, manipulation, and how the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones who look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the girl next door. Picture this, it's 1987 and you're at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough, Ontario. At a nearby table sits what appears to be the perfect couple. He's tall, athletic, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confident smile that suggests he's never met a stranger. She's petite and stunning, with flowing hair and an infectious laugh that draws admiring glances from across the room. They're young, attractive, and seem completely in love. If you saw Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka that night at their first meeting, you might have thought they belonged in a magazine advertisement or a romantic movie. They looked like they had stepped out of a catalog selling the Canadian dream: successful, beautiful, destined for a perfect life together. But appearances, as we'll discover, can be the most deadly deception of all. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was 23 years old when he met 17-year-old Karla Homolka at that restaurant. To anyone watching, it seemed like love at first sight. He was charming, successful in his accounting career, and drove a gold Nissan 240SX that suggested he was doing well for himself. She was a veterinary assistant with dreams of working with animals, sweet-natured and popular among her friends and family. What no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that Bernardo was already living a double life. By day, he was the charming businessman. By night, he had been prowling the streets of Scarborough as a serial rapist, leaving a trail of traumatized women in his wake. Let's take a step back to understand who Paul Bernardo really was before Karla entered his life. Starting in May 1987, just months before he would meet his future wife, a predator had begun terrorizing women in the Scarborough area. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. The rapist would approach women who were alone, often near bus stops or while they were walking home late at night. He was organized, methodical, and seemed to take pleasure not just in the physical assault, but in the psychological terror he inflicted. The police had been investigating these attacks for months, but the perpetrator was clever. He varied his methods, changed locations, and left little physical evidence. What they didn't know was that their suspect was hiding in plain sight, working a respectable job, living with his parents, and to all outward appearances, living a completely normal life. Between 1987 and 1990, Bernardo would assault at least 13 women. But here's what makes this even more chilling. During this same period, he was building a relationship with Karla Homolka, and rather than being horrified by his crimes, she would eventually become his willing accomplice. The question that haunts this case is, when did Karla learn about Paul's violent tendencies, and more importantly, why did she choose to stay? Karla Homolka, by all accounts, had been a normal teenager before meeting Bernardo. She came from a middle-class family in St. Catharines, Ontario. Her parents, Dorothy and Karla Homolka, had immigrated from Czechoslovakia and built a comfortable life for their 3 daughters. Karla was close to her younger sisters, Lori and Tammy, and seemed to have a bright future ahead of her. But meeting Paul Bernardo changed everything. Friends and family would later describe how Karla began to change after she started dating Paul. She became more secretive, more withdrawn from her family, and increasingly focused on pleasing her new boyfriend. What they interpreted as typical young love was actually something far more sinister: the gradual psychological manipulation and grooming of a vulnerable teenager by a seasoned predator. Bernardo didn't just want a girlfriend, he wanted a partner in crime, someone who would not only tolerate his violent fantasies but actively participate in them. And in Karla Homolka, he found exactly what he was looking for. The couple's relationship quickly became sexual and intense. But what Karla's family didn't know was that Bernardo was already introducing violent elements into their relationship. He was testing her boundaries, seeing how much she would accept, how far she would go to please him. And disturbingly, Karla seemed willing to go very far indeed. December 23, 1990. It should have been a night of family celebration, preparing for Christmas. Instead, it became the night that would reveal the true depths of evil that Paul and Karla were capable of together. Karla's 15-year-old sister Tammy was everything a big sister should protect: innocent, trusting, and excited about the holidays. She looked up to Karla and was eager to spend time with her and her boyfriend Paul, who had always been kind to her. What happened that night represents one of the most heinous betrayals in criminal history. Paul had become obsessed with the fact that Karla wasn't a virgin when they met, and he had developed a twisted fixation on Tammy. Rather than protecting her little sister, Karla agreed to help Paul assault her. Using animal tranquilizers stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked, Karla drugged her own sister. What followed was a carefully planned and executed assault that they recorded on video. But their plan went horribly wrong when Tammy began choking on her own vomit and died. When paramedics arrived, Paul and Karla played the role of devastated family members. They claimed Tammy had been drinking and had choked. The death was ruled accidental, and the family mourned what they believed was a tragic accident. But for Paul and Karla, Tammy's death wasn't a wake-up call that made them realize how far they had fallen into darkness. Instead, it was a stepping stone to even greater horrors. June 29, 1991. 6 months after murdering her sister, Karla Homolka walked down the aisle in a beautiful white dress to marry Paul Bernardo. The wedding was everything a young woman might dream of: elegant, romantic, with family and friends gathered to celebrate what appeared to be a perfect union. The wedding photos show a radiant bride and a handsome groom, surrounded by loved ones who had no idea they were celebrating the union of two killers. Karla's parents, still grieving the loss of their youngest daughter, tried to find joy in seeing their middle daughter so happy. Paul's family, who had always found him charming if sometimes difficult, welcomed Karla as the perfect daughter-in-law. But beneath the surface of this fairy tale wedding was a relationship built on shared violence and an escalating appetite for cruelty. The couple was already planning their next crimes, and marriage would only make them bolder. What's particularly chilling about this period is how normal they appeared to everyone around them. They bought a house in Port Dalhousie, a picturesque neighborhood in St. Catharines. Paul continued working in accounting while building what would become a successful business smuggling cigarettes. Karla worked at a veterinary clinic and was beloved by her colleagues for her gentle way with animals. Their neighbors saw them as the ideal young couple: attractive, successful, and seemingly very much in love. They threw parties, maintained their property beautifully, and were always friendly and polite. No one suspected that their basement would soon become a chamber of horrors. June 15, 1991. 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffy had been at a friend's house and was trying to get back into her own home after missing her curfew. She found herself locked out and was sitting on her front steps, trying to figure out what to do, when a car pulled up. The man who got out seemed friendly enough. He was well-dressed, polite, and claimed he just needed directions. Leslie, like most teenagers, had been taught to be helpful and polite to adults. She approached the car to help, and in that moment, her life was effectively over. Paul Bernardo had been cruising the neighborhoods looking for a victim, and Leslie's situation made her an easy target. He forced her into his car and drove her back to the house he shared with Karla, where what followed was 2 days of unimaginable torture and abuse. But here's what makes this case so particularly disturbing. Karla wasn't an unwilling witness to Leslie's suffering. The videotapes that would later be discovered showed that she was an active, enthusiastic participant. She brought Leslie food, engaged in conversations with her, and participated directly in the assaults. At times, she appeared to be directing the action. For 2 days, Leslie endured horrors that no human being should ever experience. And throughout it all, Both Paul and Karla treated the situation as if it were entertainment, something they were doing for their own pleasure and amusement. On June 17th, they murdered Leslie and dismembered her body, disposing of the remains in a lake. They then returned to their normal lives as if nothing had happened. Paul went to work, Karla continued at the veterinary clinic, and they maintained the facade of being a normal, loving couple. When Leslie Mahaffy was reported missing, the community responded exactly as you would hope, with concern, determination, and collective action. Hundreds of volunteers joined search parties, combing through parks, fields, and wooded areas looking for any sign of the missing teenager. The local media covered the story extensively, and Leslie's photo appeared on posters throughout the region. What makes this even more grotesque is that Paul and Karla were living their normal lives during this time, watching the news coverage of the search for Leslie, seeing her parents pleading for information, witnessing a community united in trying to bring her home safely. And they said nothing. In fact, they did worse than nothing. They attended some of the community meetings about Leslie's disappearance, presenting themselves as concerned neighbors who wanted to help. Karla even joined some of the search parties, spending her weekends looking for a girl she knew was already dead, whose body she had helped dispose of. This level of deception goes beyond simple criminality. It represents a complete absence of human empathy, a willingness to torture not just their direct victims but entire families and communities. April 16, 1992. Good Friday. A day that should have been peaceful and reflective instead became another nightmare for the Bernardo Homolka partnership. 15-year-old Kristen French was walking home from Holy Cross Secondary School when she was approached by a couple in a car. The woman seemed distressed and was asking for directions to a nearby church. Kristen, being a good Samaritan, approached the car to help. That woman was Karla Homolka, and this was a carefully planned abduction. Using Karla as bait was a calculated strategy. A young woman asking for help seemed non-threatening, even to a teenager who might have been cautious about helping a man alone. Once Kristen was close enough to the car, Paul forced her inside, and they drove her back to their house of horrors. What followed was 3 days of torture, rape, and psychological abuse, all recorded on video for their later enjoyment. But what's particularly heartbreaking about Kristen's case is that she fought back. The tapes showed that she maintained her dignity and humanity even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. She tried to reason with her captors, attempted to humanize herself to them, and never stopped believing that she might somehow survive this ordeal. On April 19th, Paul and Karla murdered Kristen French and disposed of her body. Once again, they returned to their normal lives, attending family dinners, going to work, and maintaining the pretense of being an ordinary young married couple. By 1993, the walls were beginning to close in on Paul Bernardo. DNA evidence from the Scarborough rapes was finally linked to him, and police were starting to make connections between the attacks and the disappearances of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French. But here's where Karla Homolka made the decision that would define the rest of this case. Instead of standing by her husband, she decided to save herself. On January 5, 1993, Karla left Paul and went to stay with her aunt and uncle. Her explanation was that Paul had become increasingly violent toward her and she feared for her safety. To support this claim, she had photographs of bruises and injuries that she said Paul had inflicted on her. This was the beginning of what would become one of the most successful manipulations of a justice system in Canadian history. When Karla Homolka walked into a police station to report domestic abuse by her husband, she presented herself as a battered wife who had finally found the courage to leave her abuser. She was soft-spoken, clearly traumatized, and seemed genuinely afraid of Paul. She had physical evidence of abuse, and her story was consistent with what investigators knew about domestic violence patterns. But Karla was playing a much deeper game. She knew that Paul was about to be arrested for the Scarborough rapes, and she suspected that he would eventually be connected to the murders of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen French. Rather than going down with him, she decided to position herself as another one of his victims. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. convince authorities that she had been so terrorized and controlled by Paul that she had no choice but to participate in his crimes. Present herself as someone who was psychologically broken by abuse, someone who was acting under duress and fear for her own life. And it worked. The police, prosecutors, and even mental health professionals who evaluated her bought into her narrative completely. Here was a young woman who had clearly suffered abuse, who was cooperating with authorities, and who seemed genuinely remorseful about what had happened. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known at the time, was that Karla was likely the more dangerous of the two killers. In May 1993, Karla Homolka's lawyers sat down with Crown prosecutors to negotiate what would become known as the deal with the devil. Based on her claims of being an abused wife who had been coerced into participating in Paul's crimes, prosecutors offered her a plea bargain that seemed reasonable at the time: plead guilty to manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen, serve 12 years in prison, and testify against Paul Bernardo. From the prosecution's perspective, this made sense. They needed Karla's testimony to convict Paul of first-degree murder, and without her cooperation, he might escape the most serious charges. 12 years seemed like a significant sentence for someone they believed had been forced to participate in crimes against her will. The deal was signed on May 14, 1993, and Karla began serving her sentence immediately. She was portrayed in the media as a woman who had been trapped in an abusive relationship and had finally found the courage to do the right thing by testifying against her abuser. But there was one crucial piece of evidence that hadn't been found yet, evidence that would reveal the true nature of Karla's involvement in these crimes. In September 1994, more than a year after Karla's plea deal was signed and sealed, Paul Bernardo's defense team made a discovery that would shock everyone involved in the case. Hidden in the house that Paul and Karla had shared were videotapes, hours of footage documenting their crimes in horrific detail. What these tapes revealed was devastating to the narrative that Karla had constructed. Far from being a reluctant, terrorized participant, the videos showed Karla as an active, willing, and often enthusiastic collaborator in the torture and abuse of their victims. She wasn't just present during the crimes, she was directing them, participating in them, and clearly enjoying them. The tapes showed Karla bringing food to the victims, engaging in casual conversation with them, and participating directly in their sexual assault and torture. In some scenes, she appeared to be the one in control, directing Paul's actions and making suggestions for how to further torment their captives. Perhaps most damning of all, the tapes showed that Karla's demeanor during the crimes was completely inconsistent with someone acting under duress. She was relaxed, talkative, and seemed to be treating the entire situation as entertainment. The discovery of the videotapes created a legal and ethical crisis. Here was clear evidence that Karla Homolka had lied about the extent of her involvement in these crimes, that she had manipulated the justice system, and that she was potentially more dangerous than anyone had realized. But legally, there was nothing that could be done. A plea bargain is a contract, and once it's been signed and the defendant has begun serving their sentence, it cannot be changed, even if new evidence emerges that completely contradicts the basis on which the deal was made. The prosecutors, the judge, and the legal system as a whole had been played by a master manipulator, and there was no recourse. Karla would serve her 12 years and be released, regardless of what the tapes revealed about her true character. This created an unprecedented situation in Canadian legal history, clear evidence that a killer had manipulated the system to receive a lighter sentence, but no legal mechanism to correct this injustice. Paul Bernardo's trial in 1995 was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Canadian history. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the videotapes, DNA evidence linking him to the Scarborough rapes, and Karla's testimony detailing his crimes. But the trial was complicated by what everyone now knew about Karla. While she was testifying against Paul, describing him as a monster who had forced her to participate in unspeakable acts, the jury and the public knew that the videotapes told a very different story. Karla spent 4 days on the witness stand, maintaining her story that she had been a battered wife acting under duress. She claimed that Paul had threatened to kill her if she didn't participate, that she was in constant fear for her life, and that everything she did was to protect herself from his violence. But anyone who had seen the videotapes knew she was lying. Her testimony was a continuation of the same manipulation that had gotten her the plea deal in the first place. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen, as well as numerous sexual assault charges related to the Scarborough rapes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years and was designated as a dangerous offender, meaning he could be held indefinitely beyond his minimum sentence. The contrast between the fates of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka tells the entire story of how this case went wrong. Paul Bernardo was sentenced to life imprisonment and remains behind bars to this day. As of November 2024, he has been denied parole 3 times and continues to serve his sentence at La Macasa Institution in Quebec. He will likely never be released, spending the rest of his life paying for his crimes. Karla Homolka, on the other hand, was released from prison on July 4, 2005, after serving her full 12-year sentence. She walked out of prison and into a new life, legally free to go wherever she wanted and do whatever she chose. The irony is profound. The killer who was arguably more manipulative, more calculating, and potentially more dangerous was the one who gained her freedom, while her partner remains locked away. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the direct result of Karla's ability to manipulate a system designed to protect the innocent. Since her release, Karla Homolka has attempted to build a new life away from the shadow of her crimes. She has lived in the Caribbean, gotten married, had children, and tried to disappear into anonymity. But the families of her victims and the Canadian public have not forgotten what she did or how she escaped appropriate punishment. Every few years, there are reports of Karla being spotted somewhere, living under a new name, working a regular job, trying to blend in with normal society. Each sighting reignites public anger about the injustice of her situation and the failure of the legal system to adequately punish her crimes. Meanwhile, the families of Leslie Mahaffy and Kristen continue to live with their loss every single day. They have had to watch as one of their daughter's killers walks free, knowing that the person who may have been the most culpable in their children's deaths escaped with what amounts to a slap on the wrist. The Ken and Barbie Killers case fundamentally changed how the Canadian justice system approaches plea bargains in major criminal cases. The Homolka deal became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making agreements before all the evidence is available, and new protocols were put in place to prevent similar situations in the future. But the damage was already done. The case exposed fundamental flaws in how the system evaluates domestic violence claims, how it assesses the credibility of cooperating defendants, and how it balances the need to secure convictions against the risk of being manipulated by skilled liars. The case also revealed uncomfortable truths about how gender, appearance, and social expectations can influence perceptions of guilt and innocence. Would a male defendant claiming to be an abused spouse have received the same sympathetic treatment? Would someone less attractive and articulate have been as successful in manipulating investigators and prosecutors? What makes the Ken and Barbie Killers case so fascinating from a psychological perspective is not just what they did, but how they were able to function in normal society while committing these crimes. Both Paul and Karla maintained jobs, relationships, and social connections throughout their period of active killing. They attended family gatherings, went to work every day, and presented themselves as a normal, loving couple. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate their criminal selves from their social selves, is a hallmark of certain types of psychopathic behavior. But what makes Karla particularly interesting to criminal psychologists is her ability to not just commit crimes, but to manipulate an entire legal system after the fact. The level of planning, manipulation, and psychological sophistication required to successfully present herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator suggests a kind of intelligence that goes beyond simple criminal cunning. It suggests someone who understood not just how to commit crimes, but how to escape consequences by exploiting societal assumptions and institutional weaknesses. In all the analysis of manipulation, legal failures, and criminal psychology, we must never lose sight of the real victims in this case: Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffy, and Kristen French. These were young women with their whole lives ahead of them, who were brutally murdered by people who saw them as nothing more than objects for their entertainment. Tammy was just 15 years old when she was killed by her own sister and the man she trusted as a future brother-in-law. She was excited about Christmas, looking forward to the future, and had no idea that the people she loved most were planning to destroy her. Leslie Mahaffy was 14 when she was abducted, tortured for 2 days, and murdered. She was a typical teenager dealing with typical teenage problems. She had missed her curfew and was locked out of her house. That moment of vulnerability cost her everything. Kristen French was 15 and walking home from school when she was abducted. She spent 3 days in captivity, fighting for her life and maintaining her dignity even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. She never stopped believing that she might survive, never stopped trying to connect with her captors as human beings. These young women deserved justice. They deserved to have their killers held fully accountable for what they did. The fact that one of their murderers walked free after just 12 years represents not just a failure of the legal system, but a betrayal of their memory. The story of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the limitations of our justice system. It shows us that monsters don't always look like monsters, that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear most normal, most trustworthy, most deserving of our sympathy. But perhaps most importantly, it shows us how easily our assumptions can be manipulated, how someone with the right combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and understanding of human psychology can game a system designed to protect the innocent. The Ken and Barbie Killers case will continue to haunt Canadian legal history not just because of the horrific crimes that were committed, but because of what it revealed about how justice can be denied through manipulation and deception. It serves as a reminder that in our rush to be compassionate, to understand, and to believe in the possibility of redemption, we must never forget that some people are simply evil, and some of them are very good at hiding it. As we close this case, remember the names of the real victims: Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffy, and Kristen French. They deserved better than they got from their killers, and they deserved better than they got from our justice system. Their stories should serve as a reminder that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, not just against those who would commit crimes, but against those who would manipulate our compassion to escape the consequences of their actions. The face of evil isn't always what we expect it to be. Sometimes it's beautiful, charming, and knows exactly how to make us believe that black is white and victim is perpetrator. The Ken and Barbie Killers case shows us that the most dangerous criminals aren't always the ones who look like monsters. Sometimes they're the ones who look like us.